Anytime. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the FDR Presidential Library. I'm Bill Harris, the director, and I'm really happy to be here today with Derek Leebaert to talk about his book, Unlikely Heroes, Franklin Roosevelt, His Four Lieutenants, and the World They Made. So glad that people turned out here in person, and we also would like to welcome our virtual audience. We'll have a conversation here, and then at a point, if you have questions, a microphone will be run to folks, and then also if you've got questions online, just submit them in the comments, and they'll get them down here to me. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Oh, and afterwards, we'll be signing some books, and so please, we hope you'll check out Derek's book. Derek is an author. He's also an editor, co-founder of the International Security, a journal at Harvard, MIT, and he's also the co-founder of the National Museum of the U.S. Army. And he won the 2020 Truman Book Award for Grand Improvisation. He's done excellent research here, so we're going to turn right to the book and get started.
It's an honor to be in Hyde Park.
I'm so glad that you're here. And since, Hyde Park is FDR, and FDR embodies what he felt was part of him here in the Hudson Valley, it seems really interesting to also talk about these four lieutenants who became such part of his life. And what was their relationship? Where were these four lieutenants from? And talk a bit just initially about who these four folks are covered in the book.
I have addressed how this administration was led during the 1930s and also during World War II. The spotlight has always been on the Titanic leader himself, FDR, of course, who, in my view, saved democracy during the 1930s and then saved civilization itself during the war. But when the spotlight is nudged from the Titanic leader himself, one gets a very different view of this 12-year presidency, how it was led day to day, how the New Deal was executed, how the home front was mobilized during World War II. These are FDR's four closest associates, the only individuals to be at the very top of government from the beginning in March 1933 until the end in April 1945.
And who are these four folks?
They would be Harry Hopkins, who was 41 at the start in 1933. He was the de facto Secretary of Public Welfare, had such a role existed. And during the war, he was FDR's closest political military advisor.
He lived in the White House even at a point.
And indeed, from 1940 onwards, for 3 years, he lived in the White House indeed. But as you'll see when we talk about these four closest associates, each of them had grievous handicaps of their own to overcome. And in Harry Hopkins' case, it was ulcers, crippling ulcers, until 1937 when he had 2/3 of his stomach removed for cancer. But it was more serious than that because there was a great self-destruction to Hopkins, as the archives show. He drank heavily, he didn't take his medicine, he flushed away his nutrients. And as he became ever more ill and ever more infirm during the war, the closer and closer he got to FDR himself. The second of the four lieutenants, the four closest associates, was Harold Ickes. Ickes described himself as a has-been and a loser when FDR plucked him from nowhere in Chicago. He was a sole practitioner lawyer. He was a Republican progressive. He was 58 at the start of the administration, and he was bipolar by any diagnosis. There were days upon days during the 12-year presidency when he literally could not speak. He self-medicated himself with Nembutal and whiskey. And he was Secretary of the Interior, but that was a vastly more expanded role than we would think of these cabinet positions today. He was also known as the Secretary of Negro Affairs, to use the term of the day, because of his passionate advocacy for Black Americans and for his championing of immigration. Any human rights issue, you could look forward to Harold Ickes being a combatant, as well as Secretary of the Interior. The third closest associate and lieutenant was the first woman in any presidential cabinet, who of course was Frances Perkins, 53 at the start. And it was she who in the administration had known FDR the longest, way back from when he was a state senator. Indeed, she had known him before the polio had struck in 1921. And in her mind, FDR was always the tall, athletic Greek god of an athlete whom she had seen vaulting over a chair during the Democratic campaign of 1920. But here too, let me add, Frances Perkins herself had a pathological loneliness. She described that it pained her physically whenever she saw her picture in the paper. She also had a tormented family life, with her husband being institutionalized for mental illness and her daughter suffering from schizophrenia. And the fourth and final closest associate of the four lieutenants, the only ones that were there from the very beginning to the very end, hands-on operators, was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace ran the government's biggest department, which was agriculture, in the 1930s, when about a third of the US population made its living from agriculture. And Henry Wallace then became vice president after running with FDR on the 1940 presidential ticket. He was the vice president during the third term. And his affliction was what the New York Times described as a freakish intellect. Henry Wallace could speak as an equal with Einstein and with the great British economist John Maynard Keynes. This freakish intellect, so-called, kept him aloof from so many others. Yes, he became a great retail politician in time, but he always had a distance and an aloofness from those of us without his intellect. And it was these four, I argue, who enabled the New Deal and much of what delivered victory on the home front during World War II. This was the tough, enduring core of the Roosevelt presidency from the very beginning to the very end. Without this tough, enduring core, it would have been exceedingly difficult for FDR to accomplish what he did in saving democracy in the 30s and winning World War II.
Well, you ended on Wallace, and let's talk about Wallace some more. And we're hoping in the future too, maybe this summer, to be doing a program with Wallace in partnership with the Wallace Global Fund to explore some issues related to climate and climate justice, because certainly that grows out of Henry Wallace's background in Kansas and his work and his agronomy. But often here, too often, unfortunately, Wallace is almost cast as a peripheral figure.
Well, all of these four are relatively unknown because historians have always focused on FDR himself, rightly so. But the big reveal of this book, and it is a breakthrough in the study of the Roosevelt presidency, is that these four individuals, as the historian Charles Kaiser just wrote in The Guardian, these four individuals are without doubt the most consequential grouping in American history to shape the destiny of the nation. And the eminent Roosevelt scholar Susan Dunn at Williams writes today of collective leadership in the Roosevelt administration. Nobody ever spoke of collective leadership under FDR. But looking at this hard, tough liberal core helps us understand how the New Deal got done, how the country was mobilized during the war, and also offers a number of lessons on government leadership for today.
Well, that's an interesting point, because frequently FDR's relationship with his advisors or his selection of advisors is frequently framed as getting people who won't get along or who don't get along and who are going to argue or who are going to fight. And this intrigue is created, and that there's this purposeful puppet master role.
Yeah, so
true.
true.
That's what I'm getting at. Do you see that too?
To be sure, these four became friends despite FDR's manipulations, which could be cruel as well as taunting and teasing. And he didn't create a group of four per se. This was a classic FDR grouping, improvised, ad hoc, but they developed a friendship very quickly. What do we mean by friendships? And this has not been seen by historians.
This was an interesting point too.
Henry Wallace, for instance, saving Harry Hopkins' life in 1939 by developing a particular form of nutrient that enabled Harry Hopkins, after his cancer operation, not to have his body starve himself to death. The Wallaces, Henry Wallace and his wife Elo, going to church every Sunday with Francis Perkins, St. James Church on Capitol Hill. Wallace and Ickes, despite their rivalries, which were fueled and abetted by FDR, becoming friends because of a common love of the land. These were friends oftentimes through gritted teeth, but because they were the only ones who came to DC in 1933, with each of them had an actual plan that had to be implemented, that they wanted to press. Harold Ickes knew everything there was to know about the environment and conservation and the interior, which of course was a passion of FDR's. Francis Perkins was going to push labor rights and justice and social insurance and oppose child labor. She had a plan for that. Harry Hopkins came to DC with his own plan about how to roll out government aid to the unemployed. And Henry Wallace, of course, had his own plan ready to be implemented about agricultural subsidies. So these four, unlike the others in this administration, they arrived in DC knowing what to do. FDR raised them to the pinnacle of power, and he allowed them to soar. And one point of context: when we think of the cabinet and top government officials, it's very different from the way we would regard such men and women today. At the time, a cabinet officer was regarded as a statesman. He, and Francis Perkins being the one she, would get 19-gun salutes. They would be deferred to as statesmen because there were no rival sources of authority in Washington really to compare. The Supreme Court justices, perhaps, but in protocol, the cabinet members were called the president's official family and were only right beneath the president himself. And if I can carry on with a final insight on Washington at that time, the vice president, John Nance Garner of Uvalde, Texas, was not a formal member of the cabinet, but he was easily one of the most formidable American vice presidents since the days of Adams, Jefferson, and Burr. And oftentimes we forget, how was New Deal legislation pushed so fast through Congress? It was all choreographed by Vice President Garner, who who had been Speaker of the House, who was a 15-term congressman, who controlled the Texas delegation, which was the strongest that any state had ever sent to Washington, and who got things done. Vice President Garner, who nearly has been written out of history by the New Deal historians, was a ferocious opponent of the Ku Klux Klan and a committed enemy of lynching.
Though hardly what one would consider particularly progressive on race issues, though.
Not progressive, but if we put this in the context of their time, there was no stronger anti-lynching proponent in government, Harold Ickes to be sure, but who could get things done but John Nance Garner. And
Though they didn't pass the lynching bill ultimately.
But when John Garner, January 2nd, 1940, brought the Southern Titans into the Oval Office and told FDR, we are now set to pass the anti-lynching bill, and an anti-lynching act would go into place that spring. It was set to pass. It didn't, and that's part of the sad explanation that's offered in this book.
Well, it's again fascinating because there are so many directions it can go, and I agree with you. I think that John Nance Garner needs a further exploration. Really, in some ways, like the vice presidency of Wallace. Those vice presidencies, you're right. There's such a titanic figure, to use your expression, in Roosevelt that you lose track of the growth of the roles of specific positions. It's because of the individual, of course, but the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Agriculture, these aren't exactly the positions you're usually thinking of as being the big power wielders in
Right.
Washington.
During the era of celebrity, which is the 1930s by any standard, these were seen as larger than life figures. And in a way they were. They shaped the world and the country that we live in today, and they became world figures very quickly. They were described by their friends and by their enemies as this foursome. And it was, again, that hard, liberal, enduring, tough core of the administration that kept on getting things done.
Now, what were some of the battles between them? There were likely and obvious alliances depending on the issue. Was it very fluid? Did they float towards one another depending on what needed to be accomplished, or out of natural affinity for ideas?
That's a perfect way of describing it, Bill. It was fluid. Remember how much improvisation there was, how to confront a Great Depression in an era in which people still knew very little about economics, how to go to war against the supreme military power in the world, Nazi Germany, at a time when America was barely armed. Everyone had to improvise, and these four, as you observed, would flow back and forth in alliances among themselves, oftentimes in opposition to FDR. And that is one of the insights of FDR's great leadership, that he would allow, to a certain extent, lots of pushback from those who disagreed with him. And to the extent that he had what was called, to use the term of the day, a psychodrama relationship with Harold Ickes, in which they would scream at each other.
And Ickes would resign.
And Ickes would threaten to resign, but FDR would mollify him. FDR knew each of these individuals and their emotional and physical vulnerabilities to a T. And he would therefore know precisely how to motivate them, how to deflate them when necessary, and how to use them for his own ends, of course, and for the purpose of the national agenda. A lot of this was really tactile. Ickes, among his injuries, had been an abused child. He hated to be touched by men. We know this because of a 4 million word diary that Ickes kept during the administration. So what would FDR do when he's sitting here close one-on-one with Ickes? He would put his hands on his knee. But in this situation, Ickes would just gush in his diary about being touched by FDR. Similarly, how would FDR tactily interact with Harry Hopkins? He would, grab him by the forearm like a soldier in the trenches. With Frances Perkins, he would sort of hold her hand and tickle her and wink. With Henry Wallace, he never would touch Wallace, nor would he ever give Wallace a nickname, just like he wouldn't play games with the admirals and the generals. Wallace, in his austerity, FDR knew how to handle him. He handled him as another capacious mind in which they could talk science together. So despite FDR's shortfalls, and there are many on race particularly, but on other issues of not perhaps fighting as strongly as he could for Social Security or labor relations, but it was this ability to lift up others as he was lifting up a nation in extremis and to get things done.
How self-aware were, you mentioned Ickes' diary, and other than Hopkins, I guess, the other three left thousands upon thousands of pages, hundreds upon hundreds of pages, thousands and thousands of words of diaries and letters. How self-aware were they of their manipulations? Did you use the most negative word of the way in which, were they aware that they were sort of being played against one another, or at times
by the end of the administration, 12 years of working together and 12 years of working for FDR, they had no illusions at all. But they are very different from what historians have called the team of rivals that worked for Lincoln during the Civil War. Remember that these four were all outsiders. None of them had any illusion that they could do FDR's job better than he, as did Lincoln's team.
So Wallace wasn't completely outsider. I mean, in terms of his family's involvement in
to be sure. But remember, he had gone bankrupt with the family business, the Wallace Agricultural Journal. He was also cornered financially in starting the Hybrid Company, which was a money loser. So in 1933, toward Henry Wallace, FDR, I believe, saw a man who was cornered, a brilliant man knowing so much about agriculture. His father, as you observed, had himself been Secretary of Agriculture in the conservative Coolidge administration. But Henry A. Wallace was cornered, as was Harold Ickes, cornered, small-time lawyer, going nowhere, caught in a disastrous marriage. Harry Hopkins had worked for FDR in Albany when Roosevelt was governor, but himself was marginalized, divorced, penurious, chomping at the bit to achieve something. And Frances Perkins, FDR knew her like the palm of his hand. FDR relished gossip. He knew all about her family. He knew about her angst, her concern with publicity, her friendships with other women. And it is the genius of FDR that he brought them all together, relative outsiders. These were not Wall Street lawyers or high-level government bureaucrats, relative outsiders, because as Eleanor would say, her husband always liked outcasts. These weren't outcasts per se, but they were in political suburbia. And consider others in this administration and around FDR. On Wednesday afternoon, May 10th, 90 years ago, at exactly this time, 6:30, FDR was going into dinner with his most loyal, long-serving assistant, who was Louis Howe. And Louis Howe himself was a sad, unfortunate, crippled individual. He was bent, he was short, his face was pockmarked. He was an outsider by any standard. So on that Wednesday, May 10th, FDR was wrapping up his day. He had met with his Secretary of the Treasury, Wooden, about the domestic crises, but he had also met that very afternoon with the ambassador from Poland and the ambassador from Germany. FDR knew that he could not concentrate entirely on the domestic crisis. He had to also be attuned to America's altering role in the world. And he had no illusions either about Hitler, who had come to office in January 1933. So throughout, we see FDR working with very strange people around him, like Louis Howe, like the four lieutenants, like his valet at that moment, who himself was physically crippled because his legs had been burnt in a work accident. So FDR would gather around him individuals who he knew were extraordinarily talented, who he was able to create and to soar while he observed all, like a very watchful monarch.
It's interesting when you think about it too, that extraordinarily talented and capable. I agree. You do look around at the people he's assembled for all their eccentricities and quirks, and the sense that so many of them were not in the sort of establishment, traditional leadership establishment. Some were, of course, but some weren't. But the systems themselves, such as the State Department, the Justice Department, were much more populated by people from that sort of world. So in foreign affairs, even, which you mentioned, we think we're talking mostly about domestic affairs here, but yet two of these people, Hopkins and well, actually all of them to some extent, but certainly Hopkins and Wallace, he also ultimately, they had a role in foreign affairs too.
They all had a role in foreign affairs. And what had not been known about Frances Perkins, for example, was that she, by the late 30s, became FDR's prime intelligence asset on the crumbling balance of power in Europe, because it was she who was abroad most of the time for the International Labor Organization meetings in Geneva. She spoke excellent French, as did FDR. And like FDR, her German was competent. She was able to soak up intelligence, come back to DC, and brief FDR personally.
And outside of your traditional channel of getting diplomatic information.
To be sure. And the State Department, yes, the diplomats said, oh, what does this woman cabinet member talk about? Cordell Hull, the Tennessean longtime congressman, was Secretary of State. And finally, in June 1940, when Nazi Germany rolled over France in 5 weeks, he had the grace to apologize to Frances Perkins for not having understood. Henry Wallace, like FDR himself, was multilingual. Wallace knew Spanish fluently, which he started learning when he became Agriculture Secretary. Like any scientist, he was a biologist, a geneticist. He spoke German perfectly, and he taught himself Russian. And he was attuned to the world as well. To be sure, FDR himself was vastly more knowledgeable about the world than perhaps anyone in Washington. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy at a time when that was among the 4 highest defense officials in the country. His French was perfect. His German adequate. We know from Sumner Wells that he even read Spanish easily. And his Dutch was conversational and fun because he prided himself not as an American aristocrat, not as an Anglo-Saxon. FDR saw himself as something distinct. He saw himself as part of the Hudson Valley Dutch squirearchy, which in his entitled view of the Roosevelts was on a distinctly higher plateau than the merely moneyed Anglo-Saxons of the Gilded Age. So he prided himself on his Dutch and on his ties to Holland, and he was able to even speak in conversational Dutch.
I want to go back to the perspective of these four, in terms of over that 12 years, they respected him, obviously, admired him even. After 12 years, and then in the 5 years after, the 10 years, well, it varied on the person and how long they lived, certainly. Did their esteem grow? Do their memoirs reflect favorably looking back? How do they approach their own views about FDR?
The reason you'll see a different FDR in Unlikely Heroes is because these four, over 12 years, would pool their insights on the president, for better or for worse. But they spoke about him a lot. They chronicled his behavior in their diaries and certainly in their oral histories. So in many ways, we see a Franklin Roosevelt that is different from the caricature in the newsreels of the ebullient, upbeat figure. We know from Daisy Suckley's diaries that this was a man who had screaming nightmares, and who had frequent screaming nightmares, to the extent that the Secret Service wouldn't even come into the room because, as they told Daisy Suckley, his cousin, they were used to that. This was a man who suffered greatly physically, who was aware of the petty humiliations, who, like the others, was able to overcome so much adversity. And by the end, by 1944, early 1945, each of these four had no illusions left about FDR, for better or for worse. They knew he was entirely untrustworthy. They knew of his petty and not so petty arbitrary cruelties. On the other hand, they were seeing him in ways that nobody else has been able to see him, and many historians have missed. For example, his brilliant mind for military logistics has been underappreciated by the historians, and we know about that from the Henry Wallace memoirs, and indeed from Harold Ickes, who became oil czar during the war and had to deploy 6 billion barrels of American oil around the world at the right time to every destroyer and tank division. FDR understood the logistics of all of this. They knew that there was nobody better on the planet to lift you up when your child had been killed in action and your son maimed in combat. FDR would be there to lift you up. But they also knew that FDR would brook no rivalry by anyone. And Henry Wallace is Exhibit A for seeing this up close.
Mm-hmm. You speak in here about the fact that he held no jealousy, though, or maybe that's the wrong word. He wasn't concerned that they would get the spotlight.
Right.
That they would be faces that people would recognize and profile. And you look at your notes and you see how often they were profiled, how often the media was trying to understand who these people were.
Yes.
And why they had this influence. So he gave them that space because he didn't feel threatened, or because he knew that they deserved it. What was
now? Remember that
there?
Conservative Democrats, as well as conservative Republicans, were from very early in the New Deal calling FDR Mussolini, calling him a fascist, calling him a communist, etc. Now, FDR understood that if he had his face on every New Deal program, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Compact, the industrialization programs, if that had all been FDR, he would have been playing into the hands of his enemies, and that would have been seriously counterproductive. He was delighted that Henry Wallace and Harold Ickes were writing best-selling books. He was delighted that in 33 and 34, all of these four lieutenants were on the cover of Time magazine. He could relish in their celebrity. And as you suggested earlier, Bill, yes, in many ways, he was a puppet master. He was controlling how far they could go. As Frances Perkins says in her oral history, FDR would say, go for it, fine. If it doesn't work, it's going to be your head. They had extraordinary latitude. And even they had so much latitude that it could be frustrating and counterproductive because they would want his support, say, to ram through a piece of legislation on labor, on Social Security. But he left so much of the heavy lifting up to them.
Well, what about with Wallace in 44, with the convention, with the vice presidency? What's occurring there? Has FDR, because he's ill, because he's not the politician he used to be, what's occurring that Wallace is demoted, in essence?
Right. One of the big mysteries of the FDR presidency is why was Henry Wallace pushed off the ticket in 1944 for Missouri Senator Harry Truman? Historians have long pondered that. The mystery to me seems to be explainable. Wallace, by 1944, had become a brilliant politician. He was known throughout the country. He was rallying the country, as in his famous speech of 1942, Century of the Common Man, which laid out America's war aims. He was a terrific retail politician. And he was being designated, not least by the Washington Post, as the champion of the New Deal. That would have grated terribly with FDR, who, of course, had a war to win. Henry Wallace, FDR understood, was a man perhaps 4 years before his time, as FDR put it. FDR also had had his fill of Wallace's intellectual intensity. They would talk deeply about science. FDR, as you said, was ill. He needed some peace and quiet and calm, no longer Wallace and Ickes and FDR having their quarrels. Harry Truman was seen as a safe, calmer figure, not a political threat. And it was FDR who did elbow Wallace off the ticket.
So I want to ask you about other people who aren't in the fore and why. What about Secretary Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, Dutchess County neighbor, longtime friend, obviously a longtime associate for the entire administration pretty much as well.
He was in Washington for the entire administration. He was not at the top for the entire administration.
Just for a year, right?
A year had gone by. And Henry Morgenthau was 43 when he became Secretary of the Treasury. And during the war, he was a powerful humanitarian voice against the Holocaust and for Jewish immigration in 39 to 42, when much of that was possible. But the consensus of the four lieutenants, and indeed of historians, is that as a Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau was over his head. And he had no background for the role, except for that 9-month stint in federal agricultural finance work. And FDR needed someone in that role of Secretary of Treasury who he could steamroll over. Why? Because FDR wanted access anytime to IRS tax records, as his son makes very clear. FDR loved going through other people's taxes. If there was a strong Secretary of the Treasury, as Frances Perkins understood, there would have been a clash. So FDR needed someone he could easily manipulate in that role. And that was the young, inexperienced Henry Morgenthau.
Do you think their views were governed by potentially the opposite of that they thought that he might have too much influence, or was there some anti-Semitism in their view?
No. At least among the good points of the four lieutenants is that there's no evidence at all of the bigotry that was commonplace at that time, whether anti-Semitic, anti-Italian, anti-Black, etc. They saw young Henry Morgenthau as servile, as an FDR puppet. And because Morgenthau, who was the second most senior official in the US government as Secretary of the Treasury, knew he was over his head, he could be antagonistic and prickly toward others in the cabinet, such as not speaking to Francis Perkins for a full dozen years. So he was not a hands-on operator of what was accomplished. The Treasury was run, to its credit, by senior civil servants, and it was run okay. And FDR had his own strange relationship with Henry Morgan that has been explored by historians, but Henry Morgenthau was not part of that inner circle.
That's interesting. Maybe he was his own circle. How did others in the cabinet view these four?
It was not a strong cabinet, and historians by and large have not gotten this right about the FDR cabinet. They simply—
That's a bold statement.
Yes. Oh,
I like that.
There are many bold statements in this book. And one, at the bare basics, historians have not understood how the Roosevelt presidency was led. Unless one grasps the pivotal, central, enduring role of the four lieutenants, a lot is going to be missed in the historical interpretation of this presidency. These were the strong, experienced individuals who composed that cabinet of 10, plus Vice President Garner. None of the others came to DC with action plans. And each of these four, as we discussed, had an action plan. The others were good, decent people. Secretary of War Dern, who had no particular understanding of the Army. Secretary of the Navy Swanson, very elderly, born during the Civil War, who, as a senator from Virginia, had been on the Senate Naval Committee. But FDR, other than in these departments run by our four, was his own Secretary of State, his own Secretary of War, his own Secretary of Navy, own Secretary of the Treasury. And Vice President Garner laid all this out for Francis Perkins one day. The president is also his own Attorney General. He's doing all of these roles, whereas he would be relatively hands-off in the ministries of each of our four.
Fascinating. So questions. I think we have some, it looks like, from online. And if anyone else here, Cliff, we'll get you the microphone. Thank you. Okay. All right, from YouTube. This goes to some of the other aides that were with him for the entire time. Where did Steve Early fit in?
Sure. Steve Early was a very, very powerful press secretary. And right there in the outer office of the White House for FDR, there were any number of aides that FDR had over these years. And Steve Early was a Southerner. He was a racist. He was violent in his approach to American blacks, as we know from a nasty physical altercation that he had in New York with a New York policeman in 1940. He was an anti-Semite, and FDR kept him on. And what this reflects about FDR is anyone's guess. But Early was an effective press secretary. He also made sure that no black journalists were ever allowed to attend a press conference, and that only changed with the war by necessity. He was a classic Virginian of that era.
And certainly not one with a a policy portfolio,
None.
who was bringing those ideas to bear, advancing.
Right.
The,
And that's the distinction I tried to make in Unlikely Heroes. When we look at our four, these are hands-on operators during the New Deal and during the war.
And what's interesting too is they're not politicians as such,
Right.
that they're wonks. They're policy people.
They're administrators, and they use that term with pride. Yeah. Administrators, getting things done, building, creating, executing.
Yeah. Executing, which is so, you wonder how someone can not only roll out programs and administer them. Some were successfully managed better than others, that's for sure, as you build a bureaucracy as rapidly as was built, but especially during World War II. It's really quite remarkable, the extent to these individuals' abilities to create, implement something. It's really remarkable. From YouTube, this question, it goes to aspects of Wallace, I think, that sometimes help marginalize him, popularly speaking. Was he considered a little flaky?
Oh, to be sure, Wallace was considered flaky because he did things like follow a diet of fish and vegetables and nuts, and didn't play golf and didn't hang out at the 19th hole, and he did things like climb mountains rather than hang out in the Senate steam bath. All of that at the time was regarded as flaky. He walked to work, he exercised, he was a terrific athlete, and he was brilliant. He studied languages and linguistics for fun. He was a terrific geneticist who built what would become a $10 billion enterprise, which eventually was sold to DuPont. And he was, by the lights of mid-20th century America, very much of an eccentric.
That's the best explanation I think I've ever heard. Just to own it face up. And you're right. The things sometimes, there are things around the edges that were unusual for the time that would, in a vice president, probably be considered unusual today. But certainly the things that people often give as examples is diet. It's comical by today's standards. Yeah. Questions right here.
I was fortunate enough to read the book, which is a terrific book, and read. Hopkins has received attention throughout the years, probably starting with Roosevelt and Hopkins, and most recently, I guess, with the Hopkins Touch, multiple books in between. But I've never before read as much about his personal issues prior to coming to Washington, and in Washington. Gambling, his illness is well chronicled. Gambling is not. I'd never seen that before. Maybe I'd missed it. But I guess my question is about your research methods. Was the information always out there, and have people just chosen to start Hopkins' history somehow as a cabinet official forward? I mean, what? I guess it's going to what historians have missed or not focused on. What has it always been easily accessible? All the things you write about, the personal lives of the lieutenants.
In my view, historians have missed a massive amount of the Roosevelt presidency and of Franklin Roosevelt himself. You had mentioned one of the first iconic volumes that was written in 1948, 1949. Roosevelt and Hopkins, by Hopkins' friend, Robert Sherwood. There would be several classics that would soon emerge thereafter. The 3 volumes on Roosevelt and the New Deal by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great book on FDR by James McGregor Burns, the multi-volumes by the Harvard scholar Frank Friedel. These are the canonical works of the 1950s that have, by and large, been repeated over and over and over again by subsequent historians who oftentimes have just added new anecdotes or who write monographs on particular aspects of the Roosevelt presidency. But that historians have overlooked the core aspects of how the Roosevelt presidency was led, by whom, let alone that these were wounded figures who had their own grouping of friendship, yes, that's a serious oversight. The material has not always been out there. The findings, such as Hopkins' self-destructiveness, which had not been reported elsewhere, his throwing out his medication, his flushing away his nutrients, his self-destructiveness that would make himself iller and iller during World War II, but that then he would use as a source of power. That has not been reported in the Hopkins touch, let alone in the classic 1948 volume of Roosevelt and Hopkins. But this is the insight that you can get by pooling the oral histories, the long diaries of the four, as well as drilling into the archives.
Thank you. Frances Perkins, you described as having loneliness as being a very central part of her being. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and maybe talk about what that was about, because she's the person I'm more familiar with than anybody else. And she was the first, my own thoughts, she was the first woman ever in such a powerful position, and took a lot of flack for that. And then also there were some intimations about whether she had lesbian relationships with some of the women. I just am very interested in your take on, quote, loneliness.
The more anyone learns about Frances Perkins, the more impressed we have to be about what she overcame and what she accomplished. As you know, she had personally witnessed so much tragedy during her earlier decades as a social organizer, as a settlement house advocate. She had seen firsthand in Washington Square the 153 deaths of the shirtwaist factory fire. She knew child labor firsthand. She educated FDR during his governorship in the many abuses of industry right here in New York, whether it was the city sweatshops or indeed mining in New York. So she bore so much of this on her highly religious, highly spiritual soul as an Episcopalian. And as you know, she is the equivalent of an Episcopalian saint today. There's a feast day for Frances Perkins in the Episcopal Church. Loneliness followed her from her young years, when her mother would tell her how unattractive she was and that she always had to wear that tricorn hat, to her sad, disappointing marriage to a once glamorous husband, to the intense relationships she had with two women during this presidency, Mary Harriman Rumsey and New York Congresswoman Caroline O'Day, both of whom died during those 12 years. There was tragedy upon tragedy in Frances's life, and arguably that added up, as FDR well knew, into this insularity, into this loneliness, into what Frances said that she only had one or two personal friends, as she called them. She had a great sense of humor. She would go to the county fairs here in New York. She could josh around with CEOs and labor union leaders. But the core, like the core of all of them, was deeply wounded.
Well, what strikes me too, when I think of the four, certainly Perkins to some extent and Wallace were more known quantities in a way. The other gentleman, not nearly so much at all. Do you think there's also a sense of there's power in being underestimated, that when people think that, who are you? You're not, we don't know who you are. And yet these people had such talent and ability Did FDR sort of appreciate this idea that that the unexpected, the surprise of it, the deep knowledge in people like that had a real power to it?
Absolutely. The country had no idea who any of these four were, with the possible exception of Henry Wallace, who was known throughout the Midwest for his advocacy of American agriculture. But even Henry Wallace could not be identified by Washington journalists when he first came to the cabinet. But within months, these were national figures. And a national figure in that day was having your face on the cover of Time magazine, as all of them did. To be sure, there were many people who made the cover of Time magazine. You know, probably Stephen Early as press secretary did, and certainly Morgenthau as Treasury Secretary eventually would. But the point of the story is that from the very beginning to the very end, they were hands-on at the top as get things done operators.
Well, any more questions? No? Well, what I want to do is thank everyone for being here, to thank you for being here and speaking about your book today. Wonderful. And you'll be signing books afterwards. We look forward to, I hope we can have you back. I want to have the author of the recent Morgenthau biography back and have you all have a conversation. That'd be fun. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for those questions.
No, that was fun. I mean, it's fascinating because